The humidity in Charleston always has a way of making secrets feel heavier, like they're clinging to your skin, waiting for a breeze that never comes. I was sitting on the wraparound porch of my newly restored colonial on East Bay Street, watching the twilight purple the sky over the harbor. I had spent 38 years as a forensic structural engineer, a man who got paid to tell people exactly why their world had come crashing down. I knew how to spot a hairline fracture in a foundation from 50 yards away. I knew when a load-bearing beam was screaming under pressure long before it actually snapped. I should have seen the cracks in my own family. "This is quite the fortress you've built for yourself, Arthur," Silas said, his voice cutting through the evening quiet like a jagged blade. He didn't wait for an invitation. He never did. He stepped onto the porch, the heels of his expensive Italian loafers, clicking against the reclaimed heart-pine floors I'd spent 6 months sourcing. Silas Vane was a man who smelled of sandalwood and predatory ambition. He was a corporate liquidator, a professional vulture who made a fortune breaking down companies and selling the pieces. My daughter, Eleanor, followed him up the steps, her eyes fixed on the tips of her shoes. She looked smaller than she had a month ago. Brittle. "It's not a fortress, Silas," I replied, not standing up. I kept my eyes on the distant flicker of the Fort Sumter light. "It's a retirement. There's a difference." "Is there?" Silas leaned against one of the Doric columns, his hand resting on the white paint. He began to pace, his eyes tracing the crown molding, the height of the windows, the sheer volume of the space. 6 bedrooms, 4.5 baths. A detached carriage house. All for one man. It seems inefficient, especially when people you claim to love are suffocating. I felt the first tremor of a structural shift. I'd heard this tone before. It was the tone Silas used right before he gutted a firm. "Eleanor, honey, you're quiet tonight," I said, turning my gaze to my daughter. She looked up, and for a second, I saw the little girl who used to help me draft blueprints in my home office. But then she glanced at Silas, and the light in her eyes extinguished. "Dad, Silas is just worried. Things have been tight. With the market shift and his firm's latest acquisition." "Tight?" I let the word hang in the humid air. "You live in a penthouse overlooking the Battery, Silas. If things are tight, sell the Porsche." Silas chuckled, but there was no myrity in it. He walked over to the porch swing and sat down, his movements deliberate. "It's not about the car, Arthur. It's about my parents. Bartholomew and Martha. You know their situation. The Atlantic City developers cleared out their neighborhood. Their condo is gone, their savings are tied up in the litigation, and they're currently living out of a suitcase in my guest room." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Bartholomew was a retired dock worker, a man of few words but solid character. Martha was difficult, but no one deserved to lose their home in their 70s. "But what does that have to do with me?" Silas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. This was the moment, the pivot. "It's simple math, Arthur. You have the space. They have the need. They're moving into the 2nd floor this Saturday. We've already hired the movers." The world went very still. I could hear the rhythmic clinking of the mast cables in the marina blocks away. I looked at Eleanor. She was biting her lip, her knuckles white as she gripped her handbag. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice dropping an octave. "It's not a request, Arthur," Silas said, his voice hardening, losing the thin veneer of politeness. "I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you how it's going to be. We're family. And since you have more than you'll ever need, and they have nothing, we're rebalancing the scales. They'll take the 3 rooms on the east wing. Martha needs the sunlight for her nerves." I stood up then. I'm 67 years old, but I'm 6'2", and I've spent my life climbing through rubble and construction sites. I still have the frame of a man who knows how to hold up a roof. You are standing on my porch, Silas, in a house I bought with 40 years of sweat and calculated risk. You don't tell me who moves in. You don't tell me how to rebalance my life. Silas didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his charcoal suit. "Eleanor and I discussed it. She's your only heir, Arthur. Technically, this house is her future. We're just accelerating the utility of it. My parents are moving in. If you make a scene, it's only going to hurt Eleanor." "Do you really want her to have to choose between her husband and a father who's being a selfish hoarder of square footage?" "Dad, please," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "They have nowhere else to go. Silas is under so much pressure. Just let them stay for a few months. Please." I looked at my daughter and felt a coldness settle in my marrow. It wasn't the request that hurt. It was the realization that she was a script reader in her own life. Silas had rehearsed this with her. He had broken her down until she believed that my autonomy was an act of cruelty against her. "The answer is no," I said. "Silas, take your wife and leave." Now, Silas took a step closer, his face inches from mine. He smelled like expensive gin and cold-blooded certainty. Saturday, Arthur, Mui, Hongam. The truck will be here. Have the rooms cleared out, or the movers will do it for you. Don't bother locking the doors. I know where you keep the spare key in the faux stone by the garden gate. I saw you use it last week. He turned on his heel and walked toward the stairs. Come on, Eleanor. Your father needs some time to process the new reality. I watched them descend the stairs. Eleanor looked back once, her face a mask of tragedy, but she followed him. She always followed him. I stood there as the taillights of Silas's black sedan disappeared into the shadows of the oak trees lining the street. I didn't move for a long time. My heart was thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. In my line of work, we have a term called progressive collapse. It's when a small failure in one part of a structure leads to a chain reaction that brings the whole thing down. Silas thought he had found my weak point. He thought he could exert enough pressure on my love for Eleanor to make my boundaries crumble. He didn't realize who he was dealing with. I don't just study how things break. I study how to make them indestructible. I walked inside and went straight to my study. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the darkness, the smell of old parchment and floor wax surrounding me. Silas thought he was the apex predator because he knew how to take things apart, but he didn't understand the first thing about a man who knew how to build. I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. It wasn't just a list of expenses. It was a record of every debt, every favor, and every legal loophole I'd encountered in 40 years of consulting for the city's elite. Then, I saw it. Through the window, a flash of light caught my eye. A plain white van was parked across the street, its engine idling. It had been there when Silas arrived, and it was still there now. A man in a dark hoodie was sitting in the driver's seat, staring directly at my house. He wasn't a mover. He wasn't a neighbor. He was watching. I realized then that this wasn't just about Silas's parents needing a place to sleep. Silas was a liquidator. He never moved pieces onto the board unless he was preparing to clear it. He didn't want my guest rooms. He wanted the ground I stood on. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in 5 years. "This is Arthur Sterling," I said when the line picked up. "I need a full structural analysis of a man named Silas Vane. Find the debt, find the hidden accounts, and find out why there's a surveillance team outside my house." I hung up and looked out at the van. The man inside tapped something into a glowing tablet. "You want to move in on Saturday, Silas?" I whispered to the empty room. "Fine, but you should have checked the blueprints first. This house isn't as empty as you think." I walked to the foyer and looked at the faux stone by the garden gate through the sidelight window. I didn't move the key. Instead, I reached into the hall closet and pulled out a heavy-duty industrial floor jack and a set of blueprints for the city's sewer and electrical grid that I'd borrowed from the planning office years ago. If Silas wanted a war of attrition, he was going to get one. But I wasn't going to fight him with shouting matches or lawyers, not yet. I was going to use the house itself. I began to work. By Hong AM, the first modification was complete. It was a simple bypass of the second-floor water main, hidden behind a decorative panel in the basement. With a single turn of a valve, I could ensure that while the rest of the house flowed perfectly, the east wing, the wing Martha wanted, would become a desert. But that was just the plumbing. I had 4 days to turn this beautiful, historic home into a psychological labyrinth that would make Silas wish he'd stayed in his penthouse. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I was back on the porch, watching the sun rise. The white van was gone, replaced by a sleek, black SUV. New watchers. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It was a photo. It was a picture of my house from 20 minutes ago, taken from the street. Underneath it, a single sentence. "It's a long way down from the top floor, Arthur. Make sure the stairs are sturdy." I gripped the railing. It wasn't Silas's tone. Silas was arrogant, but he wasn't a street thug. This was someone else. Someone Silas owed. The realization hit me like a physical weight. Silas wasn't just being a greedy son-in-law. He was desperate. He was being hunted, and he was trying to use my home as a bunker or as collateral. I smiled, though there was no joy in it. If Silas was looking for a bunker, he'd come to the right man, but he'd forgotten the golden rule of structural engineering. The person who knows how the house was built is the only one who knows how to make it swallow you whole. The threat sat on my nightstand like a ticking clock. I didn't call the police, not yet. In my world, calling the authorities before you understand the load-bearing capacity of your opponent is a rookie mistake. You don't call the fire department when you see a spark if you're standing in a room full of gasoline. You find the source of the fuel first. I spent the rest of that night in my drafting room, surrounded by the ghosts of projects past. I've always believed that you can tell everything about a person's soul by the way they treat a foundation. Some people want the flashy facade, the marble columns, and the gold leaf trim, but they're happy to let the basement flood as long as the neighbors can't see it. Silas was exactly that kind of man. I should have known it the day Eleanor brought him home to our old cottage on Sullivan's Island 7 years ago. She was so proud of him. "He's a fixer, Dad," she had told me, her eyes bright with a naivety that still breaks my heart when I think about it. "He takes broken things and makes them profitable again." I had watched him walk across my lawn that day, his eyes not on my daughter, but on the coastline. He wasn't admiring the sunset, he was calculating the price per square foot of a subdivided lot. He shook my hand with a grip that was too practiced, a new money man trying desperately to feel old money. He spoke in buzzwords: synergy, optimization, equity. I saw the first hairline fracture then, a small gap between who he claimed to be and the hollow ring of his words. But Eleanor was happy, and for a father who had raised a daughter alone since she was 8, her happiness was the only structural requirement I cared about. I thought back to their wedding at the Hibernian Hall. It was a lavish affair, funded mostly by a loan. Silas insisted on taking from my retirement fund a loan he called an investment in the family's future. I'd given it to him, not because I trusted him, but because I didn't want Eleanor to start her life in debt. I realize now that I was just reinforcing a failing structure. I was the shoring timber holding up a roof that was already starting to rot. I moved to the window and pulled the curtain back just a fraction. The black SUV was still there, parked near a moss-draped oak tree. The Watchers. I didn't know it yet, but the man in that SUV wasn't working for Silas. He was the reason Silas was so desperate to get inside my walls. Wednesday morning, I decided to do some site inspection of Mullen that reel. I drove my old restored truck, nothing flashy, just solid steel down to the battery. Silas and Eleanor's penthouse was a monument to glass and arrogance, perched atop one of the newer luxury buildings that the Preservation Society had fought so hard against. I didn't call ahead. I walked past. When the doors opened directly into their foyer, the silence was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't the peaceful silence of a happy home. It was the pressurized silence of a vacuum. Martha was sitting on a designer sofa that looked like it had never been sat on. She looked older than she had at the dinner party 3 months ago. Her hair, usually a stiff helmet of silver, was slightly disheveled. Bartholomew was nowhere to be seen. "Martha, I heard you were having some trouble with your neighborhood," I said, keeping my voice neutral. I looked around. There were boxes everywhere, but they weren't packed with care. They looked like they'd been shoved together in a panic. "It's a nightmare, Arthur. Silas says we have to leave today. He says your place is the only one safe enough." She looked at me, and for a second, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. "He says the men from the development company are aggressive." "Aggressive how?" I asked, stepping further into the room. "They've been following us, standing outside our door. Silas told us if we stay at the penthouse, we're putting Eleanor in danger." I felt the blood in my veins turn to slush. Silas wasn't moving his parents in because they were broke. He was moving them in because they were targets. He was using my home, a house built with double brick walls and a reinforced foundation, as a human shield for his family's liabilities. "Where is Silas, Martha?" "In the office. He's been on the phone all morning. He sounds scared, Arthur. I've never seen him scared." I walked toward the frosted glass doors of the home office. I could hear Silas's voice, muffled but frantic. "I told you, Jax, I'll have the collateral by Monday. The house is worth $4 million easy. Once I have my parents in there, the old man will sign whatever I put in front of him. He's soft on his daughter. I just need the weekend to break his spirit." I stopped. My hand was inches from the handle. Jax. The name sent a chill through me. Jax Blackwood wasn't a developer. He was a high-stakes private lender, with a reputation for taking his interest in blood if the cash wasn't available. He specialized in predatory loans to men like Silas, men who lived 10 times larger than their bank accounts allowed and thought they were too smart to get caught. "I don't care about your timeline." A voice boomed from the speakerphone. It was deep, gravelly, and held the unmistakable weight of a man who had never lost an argument. "You owe $3 million on the Atlantic City project, Silas. You skipped out on the payment. If that house isn't in my name by Tuesday, I'm not coming for the old man. I'm coming for Eleanor, and I'll start with her hands." I heard Silas let out a shaky breath. "She's his only child. He'll fold. I'm moving the parents in Saturday to force the issue. He won't kick out 2 seniors in front of his daughter." "He'd better not," Jax replied. Because my boys are already tired of sitting in that SUV. Saturday, Silas. Or the liquidator becomes the liquidated. The line went dead. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I had heard enough. This wasn't a family squabble. This was a hostile takeover of my life. And my daughter was the leverage. I walked back to the foyer. Martha was still staring at the floor. Arthur, are you okay? You look pale. I'm fine, Martha, I said, my voice sounding like it was coming from a long way off. I just realized I have a lot of work to do before Saturday. I didn't wait for her to respond. I left the penthouse and took the elevator down, my mind racing faster than the floor counter. Silas wasn't just a greedy son-in-law. He was a carned rat who had sold his soul to a monster and was now trying to pay the debt with my life's work. What he didn't realize was that I wasn't soft. I had spent 38 years dealing with the most ruthless contractors, the most corrupt city officials, and the most dangerous structural failures in the South. You don't survive in forensic engineering by being a pushover. You survive by knowing exactly where the rot is and how to cut it out without the whole building collapsing on your head. As I walked to my truck, I noticed the black SUV pulled out of its spot and began to follow me. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. I drove back toward East Bay Street, but I didn't go home. I made a detour to a commercial supply warehouse near the industrial docks, a place where they didn't ask questions if you had enough cash. I bought 3 industrial-grade electromagnetic locks, 2 high-decibel perimeter alarms, and a dozen cans of professional-grade expanding foam. I should have felt panicked, but instead, I felt a strange, cold clarity. It was the same feeling I got when I stood in the basement of a skyscraper and realized the pylons were sinking. There's a brief moment of horror, followed by the immediate, mechanical need to fix it. I arrived back at my house and pulled into the garage, closing the door behind me before the SUV could see what I was unloading. I went to my kitchen and sat at the island, spreading out the original blueprints of the house. I had designed this place myself. I knew every wire, every pipe, every hollow space between the studs. Silas thought he knew the spare key location. That was cute. I had designed 3 different ways into this house that didn't involve a door at all. My phone buzzed. A text from Eleanor. Dad, Silas says he's sorry about the way he acted. We're all just so stressed. Please, can we have dinner Friday? Just the 3 of us? He wants to apologize properly. I looked at the screen. A proper apology. Or, more likely, a way to get me out of the house so they could move the parents in early. Or maybe a way to see if I'd already started making a move. I typed back. Dinner sounds lovely, Eleanor. Let's do Friday at bar. Home at Hall's Chop House. My treat. I knew the restaurant well. It was loud, crowded, and had multiple exits. It was the perfect place for a diversion. But as I set the phone down, I looked at the security feed on my tablet. The SUV was parked across the street again. But this time, a second car joined it. A gray sedan. 2 different teams. One was Jack's Blackwood's crew. But who was the other? I zoomed in on the gray sedan's license plate. It was a rental. I pulled up a private database I used for vetting subcontractors and ran the plate. The result came back in seconds, and it made the hair on my arms stand up. The car was registered to a shell company owned by a man named Harrison Sterling, my brother, a man I hadn't spoken to in 15 years. The black sheep of the Sterling family, who had disappeared into the world of international high finance and shadow banking after he tried to embezzle from our father's estate. What happened next changed everything. I realized that Silas wasn't the only one trying to liquidate me. The fractures weren't just in my marriage or my home. They were in my bloodline. I stood up and walked to the basement door. I had 3 days until Saturday. 3 days to turn this house into a cage. But as I reached for the light switch, I heard a sound from the garden, a faint, metallic scrape. Someone was already trying the spare key. I didn't turn on the light. I reached for the heavy iron fire poker hanging by the hearth and moved toward the back door, my heart thumping a steady, dangerous rhythm. I told you, Silas, I whispered to the dark house. You should have checked the blueprints. The door handle turned, slow and deliberate. The stone key was being used. But what the intruder didn't know was that I'd replaced the deadbolt 3 hours ago with a remote-controlled electronic shackle. The handle turned. Click. Nothing. The intruder cursed a low, muffled sound. I leaned against the wall, inches from the door, and waited. I wasn't afraid. I was an engineer. And I was about to teach these people the most important lesson in structural integrity. If you try to force a load onto a building that wasn't designed to carry it, the building doesn't just break, it fights back. The intruder stayed silent on the other side of the oak door for a long minute. Through the heavy wood, I could hear the faint, rhythmic rasp of their breathing. I held the iron poker tight, my knuckles white, as I watched the red light of the electronic shackle through the darkness. Then a soft thud, the sound of someone jumping off the back porch into the hydrangea bushes. They were gone, but the air in the house felt different now. It felt violated. I didn't turn on the lights. I retreated to the basement, the only place where I felt like the master of my own domain. In the center of the room, under a single hanging bulb, I laid out the tactical map of the property. I had 38 years of experience in structural forensics, but tonight, I was looking at my home through the eyes of a fortress commander. Silas thought he was playing a game of emotional checkers. He thought he could use his parents as a Trojan horse to get inside my perimeter, and then hold the house hostage until I signed over the deed to satisfy his debt to Jax Blackwood. But the appearance of that gray sedan, the link to my brother, Harrison, changed the math. Harrison was a man who didn't deal in small-time debt. If he was involved, this wasn't just about a $3 million loan. This was about the Sterling Family Trust, a dormant fund my father had set up decades ago that required my signature to dissolve. "You're all coming for the foundation," I whispered, the blueprints sprawling before me like a battle plan. I spent the next 6 hours in a fever of mechanical preparation. I wasn't just an engineer anymore. I was a ghost in the machine. I started with the HVAC system. Using the industrial expanding foam I'd bought, I partially blocked the return vents on the second floor. It was a precise calculation enough to restrict airflow so the rooms would become stiflingly hot within an hour of the AC being turned on, but not enough to trigger the system's pressure sensors. Next, I moved to the plumbing. I installed a series of solenoid valves in the crawlspace. Wired to a central control panel I hid behind a false brick in the laundry room. With a flick of a switch, I could cut the water to the master suite while leaving the kitchen sink perfectly functional. I even rigged the water heater's thermostat. If anyone stayed in the shower for more than 4 minutes, the water would plummet to a bone-chilling 38 degrees. It was psychological warfare disguised as maintenance issues. I wanted Martha and Bartholomew to feel the house rejecting them. I wanted them to complain, to whine, to make Silas's brilliant plan a living hell of domestic misery. By Born. Hongam. I was exhausted, but I wasn't finished. I pulled up the floorboards in the upstairs hallway, right at the threshold of the east wing. I loosened the subfloor screws just enough. To a casual observer, the floor looked solid. But to someone walking on it, every step would produce a loud, haunting ground that sounded like the house was about to collapse. I sat back on my heels, wiping grease from my forehead. I didn't know it yet, but the apology dinner on Friday was going to be the catalyst for the first major fracture in Silas's facade. Friday arrived with a heavy, bruised-looking sky. The humidity was so thick you could almost grab it. I dressed in a charcoal suit, the one I wore for court testimonies, and drove to Hall's Chop House. I arrived 10 minutes early and took my seat. The restaurant was a hive of Charleston's elite, the air filled with the scent of seared steak and expensive bourbon. When Silas and Eleanor walked in, they looked like the perfect couple. Silas was wearing a navy blazer and a smile that probably cost more than my first car. Eleanor looked fragile, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an exit. "Arthur," Silas said, extending a hand. "Thank you for meeting us. I know things have been strained." I took his hand. His palm was slightly damp. The predator was sweating. "Strained is one word for it, Silas. Hostile is another." "Dad, please," Eleanor said, sitting down quickly. "Can we just have a nice meal? Silas really wants to make things right." We ordered. Silas spoke about family values and intergenerational support. He sounded like a brochure for a crooked retirement home. I watched him, waiting for the crack. It came between the appetizer and the main course. "So, Arthur," Silas leaned in, his voice dropping. "I've taken the liberty of drafting some paperwork, just for the transition. Since my parents will be staying indefinitely, I thought it would be best if we formalize the arrangement. For insurance purposes, you understand." He slid a leather folder across the table. I didn't open it. I knew what was inside. It wasn't a lease agreement. It was a power of attorney and a partial transfer of title. "Is that why the men in the black SUV are outside my house, Silas?" I asked, my voice calm and conversational. "For insurance purposes?" The color drained from Silas's face. Eleanor looked at him, her brow furrowing. "What SUV, Dad?" "He's joking, Eleanor," Silas snapped, his composure slipping for a fraction of a second. Arthur has an active imagination. Retirement does that to a man. I saw the men, Silas. I also saw the gray sedan, I said, leaning forward. Does Harrison know you're this bad at managing your debts? Or did he send the car to make sure you didn't run off before the deed was signed? Silas's hand gripped his wine glass so hard I thought the stem would snap. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. I think Jax Blackwood is losing patience. And I think you've promised him my home as a way to pay for your Atlantic City failure. I turned to Eleanor. Honey, did he tell you that his parents aren't broke? They're being used as human shields because your husband owes $3 million to a man who breaks kneecaps for fun. Silas. Eleanor's voice was a whisper. Is that true? He's lying, Eleanor. He's trying to drive a wedge between us because he's a lonely, bitter old man who doesn't want to share his toys. Silas was nearly shouting now. A few heads turned at nearby tables. I stood up, tossing my napkin onto the table. The dinner is paid for. Enjoy the steak, Silas. You're going to need your strength for tomorrow. You can't stop it, Arthur. Silas hissed as I walked away. The movers are coming at Mue. Hung. If the gate is locked, we'll take it off the hinges. My parents are moving in, and you're going to sign those papers, or Eleanor is going to find out exactly how unsafe the world can be. I didn't stop. I walked out into the humid night, the valet bringing my truck around. As I drove away, I checked my rearview mirror. The gray sedan was following me, but the black SUV stayed at the restaurant. They were splitting up. One to watch the asset, one to watch the mark. What happened next changed the stakes entirely. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something strange. The front door was slightly ajar. I knew I'd locked it. I pulled my truck into the garage, heart racing, and entered through the mudroom. I moved silently through the kitchen, my hand finding the heavy brass candlestick on the sideboard. I reached the foyer and stopped. There was a man sitting in my armchair. He wasn't Silas. He wasn't a thug. He was older, dressed in a bespoke Italian suit, sipping a glass of my 30-year-old scotch. You always did have good taste in spirits, Arthur, the man said. Harrison, I said, the name tasting like ash. My brother looked up, his eyes cold and calculating. Silas is a moron. A useful moron, but a moron nonetheless. He thinks he's liquidated you for a house. I told him he was thinking too small. What do you want, Harrison? The trust, Arthur. The Sterling Fund. It's sitting there, collecting dust, and we both know you're never going to use it. Sign it over to me, and I'll make Silas and his creditors disappear. I'll buy him off, send his parents to a nice villa in Florida, and you can keep your precious house in peace. And if I don't? Harrison stood up, smoothing his jacket. Then I let Jax Blackwood off the leash. And believe me, Arthur, Jax doesn't care about architecture. He'll burn this house down with you inside it just to collect the insurance money that I, as your brother, will graciously manage for Eleanor. He walked toward the door, pausing at the threshold. Saturday morning, Arthur. Silas brings the parents at Mue. Hung. I'll be watching from the car. If the papers aren't signed by noon, the house gets renovated. Permanently. He stepped out into the night. I stood in the center of my foyer, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I was being squeezed by two different forces, one from within my family, one from without. A structural engineer knows that when a building is being squeezed from both sides, the only way to survive is to create a void in the middle. I went to my control panel in the laundry room. I had 4 hours until sunrise. I looked at the blueprints one last time. There was a secret I'd never told anyone about this house. When I built it, I'd found an old Prohibition-era cellar beneath the foundation, a stone-walled bunker that didn't appear on any city records. I'd reinforced it with steel and outfitted it with its own ventilation. I realized then that I wasn't going to fight them for the house. I was going to let the house swallow them. Saturday is coming, I whispered, my fingers dancing over the switches. And I hope you're all ready for the basement. As the first light of Saturday morning broke over the Cooper River, I wasn't in my bedroom. I was in the bunker, watching 16 different camera feeds on a bank of monitors. The black SUV pulled up at Chin. Bonmuelam AM. The moving truck arrived at Chin. Nummuelam Am. And at exactly Mue, Hong Am, Silas's Porsche pulled into the driveway, Eleanor in the passenger seat, looking like she was heading to a funeral. I reached for the master switch. It was time to see if my calculations were correct. Welcome home, I said to the screen. The first mover stepped onto the porch. He reached for the handle, but I didn't unlock it. Instead, I triggered the first open loop. The mover, A burly man with vein liquidation embroidered on his shirt yanked at the front door handle. He expected it to be locked. He likely expected to have to use a crowbar. Instead, the heavy oak door swung inward with an eerie, oiled silence, as if the house itself were exhaling. Through the camera feed, I watched Silas step out of his Porsche. He looked triumphant, a conqueror arriving at the gates of a fallen city. He straightened his silk tie and gestured for his parents to follow. Bartholomew looked hesitant, clutching a small wooden footlocker, while Martha marched forward with a designer suitcase, her jaw set in a mask of entitlement. Eleanor trailed behind them, her face pale, looking up at the house as if it were a monster about to swallow her whole. "Arthur!" Silas shouted into the foyer, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We're here. Don't make this difficult." I sat in the bunker, 3 feet below the foundation, surrounded by the hum of cooling fans and the glow of high-definition monitors. I didn't answer. I wanted the silence to be the first thing that unnerved them. Silas led the group into the living room. "He's probably hiding in his study, sulking like a child," he muttered to Martha. "Ignore him. Move the trunks to the second floor. The east wing is yours." As the movers began lugging heavy crates up the grand staircase, I triggered the first phase of the settling effect. A low, resonant groan rumbled through the floorboards, a sound I'd engineered by installing a series of low-frequency transducers against the floor joists. It wasn't loud, but it was deep enough to vibrate in your marrow. The movers stopped mid-step. Martha gripped the banister. "What was that?" she squeaked. "Just an old house settling under the weight," Silas snapped, though I saw him glance nervously at the ceiling. "Keep moving." They reached the second-floor landing. Martha entered the east wing bedroom, the one she had demanded for its soothing sunlight. Within seconds, the psychological trap snapped shut. The room was already 85 degrees, the blocked vents having turned the space into a stagnant kiln. "Silas, it's sweltering in here." Martha's voice drifted down the hallway. "And there's a strange smell." The smell was a small vial of organic sulfur-based compound I'd placed inside the light fixture. As the bulbs warmed up, the scent of rotting eggs began to permeate the expensive wallpaper. I watched Silas stomp into the room, his face turning a blotchy red. "It's just been closed up, Mother." "Open a window." He reached for the sash of the large Victorian window. I had replaced the counterweights with slightly heavier lead slugs. When he pulled, the window didn't budge. He put his weight into it, grunting, until it suddenly flew up with a violent crack, then slammed back down, narrowly missing his fingers. "The hardware is jammed," Silas roared. "Arthur, where are you?" He stormed back to the hallway, but as he reached the threshold of the guest wing, he stepped on the loosened subfloor I'd prepared. The wood didn't just creak, it shrieked, a long, splintering sound that made him jump back, his heart visibly racing. "This place is a death trap," Bartholomew whispered, his voice trembling. "Silas, maybe we should find a hotel." "We're staying," Silas hissed, his eyes wild. "We need this address. Now get settled." While they were distracted by the maintenance issues on the second floor, I saw the gray sedan Harrison's car pull up to the curb. My brother didn't get out. He sat behind the tinted glass, a shark circling a sinking ship. Then, the black SUV arrived. 2 men I recognized from the Jack's Blackwood file got out. They didn't look like movers. They wore tactical jackets and carried heavy equipment bags. They didn't knock. They walked right into my house, following Silas's trail. "Drake," one of the men shouted. "Blackwood wants an update. Why isn't the old man's signature on the deed yet?" Silas met them in the foyer, his bravado crumbling like dry rot. "I'm working on it. He's in the house somewhere. I just need to find him." "Find him fast," the man said, stepping close to Silas, dwarfing him. "Jax is on his way. He wants to see the signed papers by noon, or we start removing the biological clutter from this property, starting with the women." He looked toward Eleanor, who was standing by the fireplace, trembling. Silas looked at his wife, then at the thug, and I saw the final betrayal in his eyes. He didn't defend her. He didn't even step in front of her. He just nodded. "Give me 10 minutes, Silas whispered. In the bunker, I felt a cold, crystalline rage. Silas wasn't just a failure. He was a coward who would trade his wife's safety for a few more hours of borrowed time. I reached for the intercom. It was time to break the silence. "The library, Silas?" My voice boomed through the hidden speakers in the crown molding, distorted just enough to sound like the house itself was speaking. "I'm in the library. Bring the papers. And bring your friends." The group froze. Silas looked at the ceiling, his face a mask of sweat and terror. He led the 2 thugs toward the library at the back of the house. Eleanor followed, her eyes wide with a sudden, desperate hope. They entered the room. It was empty. The walls were lined with thousands of books, the air smelling of old leather and cedar. In the center of the room sat a single mahogany desk with a pen and a bottle of ink. "Arthur?" Silas called out, his voice cracking. "Stop the games. Come out and sign this, and everyone stays safe." "I'm already here, Silas," I said. "Look at the floor." In the center of the library, the heavy Persian rug had been pulled back. A steel hatch, flush with the floorboards, sat dead center. "You're in the basement?" Silas laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "You think a cellar is going to save you? Open it up, or these gentlemen will use a torch." "I'm not in the basement, Silas," I replied. "I'm in the foundation, and you're standing on a structural liability." Before he could react, I triggered the electromagnetic locks on the library doors. The heavy oak slabs slammed shut with the force of a gunshot. Clang, clang. The thugs lunged for the door, but these weren't standard hinges. I had reinforced them with steel plating and 3-inch hardened bolts. "What the hell is this?" the lead thug roared, kicking the door. It didn't even quiver. "This is a containment protocol," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly calm. "Silas, you told me I was inefficient for living in such a large house. You were wrong. This house is a precision instrument, and right now, you're all inside the mechanism." I hit the switch for the library's ventilation. Instead of air, a thick, white mist began to pour from the vents. It wasn't gas, it was the high-pressure fire suppression fog I'd rigged, mixed with a heavy concentration of menthol and peppermint oil. It was harmless, but it was blinding, cold, and made it nearly impossible to see more than 6 inches in front of your face. "I can't see." Eleanor cried out. "Eleanor, stay by the desk," I commanded. "The rest of you don't move." Through the infrared cameras, I watched the chaos. The thugs were flailing, reaching for their weapons. Silas was curled in a fetal position under the desk. But then, I saw something I hadn't planned for. On the exterior monitor, Harrison was finally getting out of the gray sedan. He wasn't alone. He had a man with him, a man with a legal briefcase and a silver-headed cane. Jax Blackwood had arrived. And he wasn't looking at the front door. He was looking at the garden gate, the gate that led directly to the ventilation intake for my bunker. "I didn't know it yet," I whispered, my heart skipping a beat. But Harrison wasn't just here to watch the liquidation. He knew about the prohibition cellar. He'd found the old plans in our father's safe years ago. What happened next changed everything. As Harrison and Jax moved toward the garden, the house's perimeter alarm began to wail not the standard siren, but a rhythmic, pulsing tone that signaled a breach of the primary foundation. I looked at the monitor. Harrison was holding a thermal lance. He wasn't going to negotiate. He was going to cut me out of my own bunker. I had Silas and the thugs trapped in the library, but I was about to be trapped in the earth. "Arthur." Harrison's voice came through the bunker's exterior mic, dripping with sibling rivalry. "You always were the better engineer, but you forgot one thing. Every bunker has a vent, and every vent has a shutoff." I felt the air in the bunker go still. The intake fans ground to a halt. The room began to heat up instantly. I looked at the screen. Silas was screaming in the library, the thugs were shooting at the door, and my brother was suffocating me 10 feet away. I reached for the red lever under the desk, the one labeled "Critical Failure." "You want the house, Harrison?" I whispered, my vision starting to blur from the rising heat. "Then you're going to have to take the whole thing." I pulled the lever. The house didn't collapse. But the sound that followed changed the structural reality of East Bay Street forever. The sound wasn't a crash. It wasn't the violent splintering of wood, or the shattered scream of glass that most people associate with a building's demise. It was a deep, tectonic groan, the sound of Matrumnum Mui, whole gallons of brackish Charleston Harbor water being diverted into the sub-foundation cavities I'd spent 2 years waterproofing. When I pulled that lever, I activated the hydrostatic equilibrium system. In a city built on a swamp, the greatest threat to a historic home is the water table. Most people fight the water. I had decided to invite it in, controlled and channeled, as a form of structural ballast. But in this moment, it wasn't ballast. It was a weapon of displacement. In the bunker, the temperature was soaring. My lungs felt like they were being lined with hot velvet. Through the monitor, I saw the library floor begin to weep. The Persian rug darkened as water bubbled up through the floorboards I had loosened earlier. Silas, still curled under the desk, let out a pathetic yelp as the cold, salty water soaked his expensive trousers. The 2 thugs from Jax Blackwood's crew stopped shooting at the door. They looked down at their boots, then at each other, their faces pale in the swirling white mist. "The house is sinking," one of them screamed. "Arthur, you crazy old bastard." Silas shrieked, climbing onto the mahogany desk. "Open the door! We're going to drown!" I didn't answer them. I was busy fighting my own battle for oxygen. I reached under the bank of monitors and pulled out a small, yellow canister, a 3-minute emergency air supply I kept for structural inspections in tight crawl spaces. I jammed the mouthpiece in, and the hiss of pure, cold oxygen hit my throat like a miracle. I looked at the exterior camera. Harrison was still standing by the ventilation intake in the garden, the thermal lance casting a demonic orange glow across his face. Beside him, Jax Blackwood leaned on his silver-headed cane, looking at the house with the detached curiosity of a man watching a bug under a magnifying glass. "He's not coming out, Harrison," Jax said, his voice picked up by the directional mic I'd hidden in the stone birdbath. "He'd rather die in his hole than give up the deed." "He won't die," Harrison spat, his voice thick with a resentment that had been simmering for 15 years. "Arthur is too meticulous for suicide. He's waiting for a pivot. He thinks he can out-engineer a landslide." Harrison turned the lance toward the secondary intake. "If he wants to stay in the dark, let's make it permanent." What they didn't realize, what Silas in the library and Harrison in the garden couldn't possibly know, was that I wasn't just an engineer. I was a man who had spent 3 decades in the pockets of the city's planning and zoning committees. I knew where the veins of the city ran. I tapped a command into my tablet. It wasn't a structural command, it was a communication. I bypassed the local grid and sent a high-priority alert to the Charleston Public Works emergency line, but I didn't send it as Arthur Sterling. I sent it using a ghost protocol code I'd been given years ago for critical infrastructure failure. To the city's sensors, it now looked like a massive water main break was occurring directly beneath East Bay Street, threatening to undermine the entire block. 10 minutes. I whispered through the oxygen mask. "Just hold for 10 minutes. In the library, the water was now 6 inches deep. The mist had cleared, but the psychological pressure had reached a breaking point. The lead thug, a man whose neck was thicker than his skull, turned his gaze toward Silas. "You said this was a walk-in," the thug growled, sloshing through the water toward the desk. "You said the old man was a pushover." "He is," Silas cried, backing away as far as the desk would allow. It's a malfunction. He's trying to scare us." "I don't get scared, Silas. I get even." The thug reached out, grabbed Silas by the lapels of his blazer, and hauled him off the desk into the rising water. "If this house goes down, you're the first thing I'm using as a flotation device." Eleanor was standing on the library's window seat, her back pressed against the glass. She looked at the chaos, the water, the violence, the husband who was currently begging a criminal for his life, and I saw the exact moment the spell broke. She didn't cry. She didn't scream for Silas to save her. She looked at him with a cold, devastating clarity. She finally saw the structural failure I'd been warning her about for years. "Dad?" she called out, her voice remarkably steady. "I know you can hear me. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." My heart cracked in that bunker. I wanted to open the doors. I wanted to run to her. But if I opened the library doors now, Jax's men would kill me before I reached the stairs, and Harrison would have the trust before the sun set. I had to let the collapse continue. Suddenly, the bunker rocked. A heavy, metallic thud echoed from above. I looked at the monitor. Harrison and Jax had been joined by a third man, a man in a dark suit I didn't recognize. He was holding a handheld hydraulic spreader. They weren't waiting for the lance anymore. They were going to pry the bunker's emergency exit hatch right out of the garden soil. "Arthur, last chance," Harrison shouted. "The city's emergency vehicles are 3 blocks away. I can hear the sirens. If we leave now, I can tell them it was a gas leak. I can save your reputation. Just give me the code to the vault." I watched as the hydraulic jaws bit into the steel rim of my exit hatch. The metal began to scream, bending under the immense pressure. I didn't know it yet, but Harrison had a second twist waiting for me. He hadn't just come for the trust. He had already filed a notice of mental incapacity against me at the county courthouse the day before. He had a psychiatrist on his payroll ready to testify that my fortification of the house was a symptom of a paranoid break. If he got me out of this bunker alive but incapacitated, he didn't even need my signature. He just needed my silence. What happened next was the only thing I hadn't calculated. I whispered to the empty room. As the hatch gave way with a sickening pop, the air from the garden rushed into the bunker. But it wasn't just air. Harrison leaned over the opening, his face silhouetted against the morning sky. But he wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, at the monitors showing the library. "Wait," Harrison said, his voice changing. "Is that Eleanor in there?" "Of course it's Eleanor," Jax Blackwood said, stepping up beside him. "She's the leverage. Keep up, Harrison." "You told me she was at the penthouse." Harrison turned on Jax, his eyes wide. "You told me the house would be empty except for Arthur and the parents." Jax smiled, a slow, predatory baring of teeth. "Plans change, Harrison. Silas was worried she'd talk to the neighbors, so I told him to bring her along." "More weight on the old man's shoulders, right?" Harrison looked back down into the bunker at me. For the first time in 15 years, I saw my brother, the boy I'd grown up with, before the greed took him. He looked horrified. He hadn't known his niece was being used as a human shield. "Arthur, get her out," Harrison hissed. "The house. The water. I didn't mean for her to be in the middle of this." "Then stop Jax," I said, my voice raspy through the mask. "Stop the men in the library." Jax Blackwood didn't wait. He saw the hesitation in Harrison and decided the partnership was over. He raised his silver-headed cane, and I realized it wasn't a cane, it was a weighted club. He swung it with a practiced, brutal efficiency, catching Harrison across the temple. My brother crumpled, falling backward into the hydrangea bushes. Jax looked down into the hatch at me. "The brother was a bore, Arthur. Let's simplify the math. You, me, and the girl. I don't need a signature if she's the sole beneficiary, and I'm her new business manager, after you have a tragic accident in your flooded basement." He began to climb down the ladder into my sanctuary. I backed away from the monitors, my hand finding the emergency flare gun I kept in the supply kit. Jax was younger, stronger, and armed. I was a 67-year-old man in a hot room, but I was in my room. As Jax's polished shoes hit the bunker floor, the sirens finally reached East Bay Street. Blue and red lights began to strobe against the garden walls above. "You're too late, Jax," I said, leveling the flare gun at his chest. "The city is here." "The city is 3 minutes away from the front door," Jax said, stepping toward me, his cane raised. "I only need 30 seconds to snap your neck." He lunged. I didn't fire the flare at him. I fired it at the high-pressure fire suppression tank behind him, the one I'd used to flood the library with mist. The tank didn't explode. It did something much worse. It sheared the valve, turning the heavy steel cylinder into a rocket. The tank flew across the bunker, striking the primary support pillar I'd installed to hold up the library above us. The sound that followed was the one I had feared my entire career. It was the sound of a structural failure that couldn't be reversed. Above us, the library floor groaned one last time. In the monitors, I saw the ceiling of the library begin to sag. Dust and plaster rained down on Silas, the thugs, and Eleanor. "The house is coming down." Silas screamed, finally finding his voice. I looked at Eleanor on the screen. She was looking directly at the camera, as if she could see me through the lens. "I didn't know it yet," I whispered, the bunker beginning to vibrate as the house above us shifted on its axis. But the only way to save my daughter was to destroy the one thing I'd spent my life building. The floor above us buckled. The feed from the library went black. And then, the darkness took the bunker too. The silence that follows a structural collapse is never truly silent. It's a terrifying, living thing, filled with the tick-tock of cooling metal, the hiss of ruptured lines, and the rhythmic thud-thud of your own heart trying to beat its way out of your chest. In the bunker, the darkness was absolute. I was pinned against the server rack, the weight of a mahogany desk or maybe a piece of the library floor pressing into my left shoulder. The air was thick with pulverized plaster and the metallic tang of the harbor water that was still trickling down from above. I couldn't feel my legs, but I could feel the cold, sharp edge of the emergency flare gun still gripped in my right hand. "Jax?" I rasped, my voice sounding like it was being squeezed through a handful of gravel. A few feet away, something shifted. A groan, low and wet. Then, the scratching of fingernails against concrete. You killed us." Jax's voice came out of the dark. He didn't sound like a kingpin anymore. He sounded like a broken machine. "You dropped the whole damn house on our heads." "I didn't drop it," I said, fighting the urge to cough. Every breath felt like inhaling a bag of dry cement. I just stopped holding it up. "There's a difference." I reached into my pocket and found my penlight, a small, titanium-cased tool that had survived 4 decades of site inspections. I clicked it on. The beam was a tiny, defiant needle of light in the fog. It illuminated Jax Blackwood. He was half buried under a pile of books and shattered timber. His silver-headed cane was snapped in two, lying in the rising puddle of salt water like a discarded toy. His face was a mask of blood and white dust, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Where's the girl?" he wheezed. "If she's dead, nobody gets the trust." "Eleanor is stronger than you think," I said, though my gut was twisting with a terror I couldn't name. She was on the window seat. "It's the most reinforced part of the room. It's a cantilevered steel box, Jax. I designed it to survive a category-numb hurricane." I shifted my weight, a hot flash of agony radiating from my shoulder as I pushed the debris aside. I wasn't just surviving, I was calculating. I looked at the ceiling of the bunker. It hadn't fully collapsed. The support pillar I'd hit with the suppression tank had buckled, but the secondary load-bearing arches, the ones I'd modeled after the Roman aqueducts, were holding. The library floor had dropped 6 feet, creating a slanted void, but it hadn't pancaked. I began to crawl, dragging my deadened legs toward the emergency exit ladder. I had to get to Eleanor. Don't leave me," Jax pleaded, his voice cracking. The man who had threatened to cut my daughter's hands off was now a terrified child in the dark. I didn't even look back. "A building is only as strong as its weakest point, Jax. Today, that was you." I reached the ladder. The hydraulic spreader had mangled the hatch, but it had also created a gap just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. I climbed, every movement a battle against the screaming nerves in my body. When I poked my head out into the garden, the world was a sensory overload. The Charleston sun was blinding. The air was filled with the discordant choir of sirens, fire trucks, police cruisers, and the heavy thrum of a news helicopter circling overhead. My garden, my beautiful, manicured garden, was a wasteland of mud and debris, and then I saw her. Eleanor was sitting on the grass near the oak tree, draped in a yellow emergency blanket. A paramedic was checking her pulse. She looked up as I dragged myself out of the hole, and for a second time simply stopped. "Dad!" she screamed, throwing off the blanket and running toward me. She hit me with the force of a tidal wave, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I let the tears come. I held her, my face buried in her hair, which smelled of plaster and peppermint oil. "I thought you were gone," she sobbed. It just vanished." "I'm here, honey. I've got you," I whispered. "Arthur?" I looked up. Harrison was sitting on the bumper of an ambulance, a white bandage wrapped around his head. He looked older than he had an hour ago. He looked like a man who had finally seen the bill for a lifetime of bad bets. "The house is a total loss, Artie," Harrison said, using the nickname from our childhood. "The city inspector is already tagging it. They're saying the foundation is undermined by the water main break. They're going to condemn the whole block for stabilization." I looked back at the house. The east wing had sagged into the earth, the beautiful white columns now tilted at a tragic angle. It looked like a ruin, a ghost of the life I'd planned. "It's just a building, Harrison," I said, though it felt like a lie. "Where's Silas?" Eleanor asked, her voice turning sharp, cold. We all looked toward the wreckage of the library. 2 firemen were hauling a figure out through the shattered bay window. It was Silas. He was alive, but he was a wreck. His silk tie was gone, his blazer was shredded, and he was clutching a sodden leather folder to his chest like it was a holy relic. He saw us and tried to stand, but his knees buckled. "The papers!" he shouted, his voice high and hysterical. "I have the papers. Arthur, you signed them. I saw you sign them." He fumbled with the folder, pulling out a handful of dripping, ink-stained pages. He held them up to the police officer standing nearby. "This is a legal transfer. I own this property." "The old man is crazy. I have the psychiatric evaluation right here." The officer took the papers, looked at them for 3 seconds, and then looked at Silas with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Mr. Vane, these aren't legal documents. This is a set of coloring book pages." Silas froze. He snatched the papers back. I watched as his eyes scanned the blurred, colorful shapes. I had swapped the documents in the library desk weeks ago, replacing his predatory contracts with the drawings my grandsons had made during their last visit. "No," Silas whispered. "No, no, no." "Silas Vane?" A new voice entered the fray. A man in a sharp, gray suit, not a paramedic, not a cop, stepped forward. He held up a badge. "I'm Special Agent Miller with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. We've been tracking the Vane liquidation group for 18 months. We were waiting for a physical manifestation of the Atlantic City embezzlement to bridge the jurisdiction." He gestured to the ruins of my house. "I think $1 million worth of harbor water in a private residence counts. Silas Vane, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and the illegal solicitation of predatory loans from known criminal entities." As the handcuffs clicked around Silas's wrists, he looked at me. His face wasn't full of rage anymore. It was just empty. He had been a liquidator, a man who thought everything had a price and everyone could be broken down into parts. He had tried to liquidate me, but he had forgotten that some structures aren't made of wood and stone. They're made of the things you can't sell. Arthur, Silas croaked as they led him away. I was family. Family is a load-bearing wall. Silas, I said, my voice steady. You were just a termite. I watched them put him in the back of a cruiser. But the victory felt hollow. My house was a ruin. My brother was a traitor. My daughter was traumatized. I had hit rock bottom, standing in the mud of my own life. But as the FBI agent walked toward the garden hatch to retrieve Jack's Blackwood, I realized something. I wasn't just a victim here. I was the architect. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. It was cracked, but the screen still flickered to life. I opened an encrypted app one Silas didn't know existed. What happened next was the real revenge, I whispered to Eleanor. What is that, Dad? She asked, wiping her eyes. It's the second half of the structural plan, I said. I hit a button on the screen labeled Final Audit. I hadn't just been recording Silas's threats. For the last 3 months, every time Silas used my loan or mentioned his firm, I had been using my forensic access to track his digital footprint. I had found the hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands. I had found the shell companies Harrison had used to funnel the Sterling Trust money. I hadn't just dropped the house on them. I had dropped the entire global financial system on them. In 30 seconds, I told Eleanor, every asset Silas Vane owns, the penthouse, the Porsche, the offshore accounts, is being frozen by the Department of Justice. And the Sterling Trust? I've moved it. It's no longer a family fund. Where did it go? Harrison asked, leaning forward, his face pale. It's now the Sterling Foundation for Historic Preservation, I said, looking my brother in the eye. It's a non-profit dedicated to protecting the very buildings you and Silas tried to tear down. You'll never touch a cent of it, Harrison. Neither will I. But Eleanor, she's the chairperson. She'll draw a salary that'll keep her comfortable for the rest of her life, but she can never liquidate the principal. Harrison let out a long, shaky breath and sat back down on the ambulance bumper. He knew he was beat. He wasn't going to jail, but he was going back to the nothingness he had started with. But then, the final twist, the one I hadn't even told myself until this moment. I looked at the city inspector, who was walking toward me with a clipboard and a red unsafe tag. Mr. Sterling, the inspector said, I'm sorry. The structural integrity of the foundation is compromised. We have to condemn the house. I know, I said. But tell me, Inspector, what happens to a condemned property on East Bay Street if the owner has a pre-approved permit for a subsurface environmental reclamation project? The inspector blinked. Well, if the owner can prove the land is being used for ecological restoration, the property taxes are waived, and the city provides a grant for the cleanup. I smiled. I reached into my coat and pulled out a damp, but readable, document I'd tucked away before the collapse. It was a permit I'd filed 6 months ago, long before Silas ever mentioned his parents. I had known this was coming. Maybe not the thugs or the water main break, but I had known Silas would eventually try to take the house. And I had prepared a way to lose the house while keeping the land. I'm not rebuilding the house, Eleanor, I said, looking at the ruins. I'm building a park, a public space, right here, in the middle of the most expensive real estate in the city. A place where nobody can ever build a penthouse or a fortress again. I looked at the black SUV, which was now being searched by the police. Jack's Blackwood was being loaded into an ambulance in leg irons. I had hit rock bottom, but rock bottom is the best place to start a new foundation. I didn't know it yet, I whispered, pulling Eleanor close as the sun began to set over the Cooper River. But the hardest part of the revenge wasn't the collapse. It was the closure. I looked at my daughter. Are you ready to go home? Where is home, Dad? She asked. Wherever the foundation is solid, I said. But as we turned to leave, I saw one more thing. A small, white envelope tucked into the debris of the garden gate. It hadn't been there before. I picked it up. There was no return address. Just my name written in a precise, architectural script. I opened it. Inside was a single key. Not a house key. A key to a safe deposit box at a bank in Switzerland. And a note. You were always the better engineer, Artie. But I was always the better accountant. Consider this your retirement bonus. Test. H. I looked at Harrison. He was gone. He had vanished into the crowd of onlookers and emergency personnel. I looked at the key, then at the ruins of my house. The hidden truth was out. The revenge was complete. But as I felt the weight of that key in my hand, I realized that the Sterling family story was far from over. "What's that, Dad?" Eleanor asked. I tucked the key into my pocket. "Just a bit of leftover hardware," I said. "Nothing we need to worry about today." We walked away from the ruins of East Bay Street, leaving the ghosts and the water behind. I had lost my house. I had lost my brother. But for the first time in my life, the structure of my world felt perfectly balanced. The plan had worked. The enemies were buried, and the daughter I loved was finally free. But as we reached my truck, I looked back one last time. The red unsafe tag was flapping in the breeze, stuck to the tilted front door. I didn't know it yet. I thought, but the park isn't the only thing I'm building on this lot. There's one more secret buried in the blueprints, and Silas is the only one who knows where to look. The final reversal was about to begin. The red unsafe tag on the front door fluttered in the salty breeze like a funeral ribbon. For 2 weeks, I lived in a state of suspended animation, staying in a small, quiet suite at the Wentworth Mansion. It was a place of high ceilings and polished mahogany, a mirror of the world I had just lost, but without the ghosts. Eleanor was in the room next to mine. Most nights, we sat on the roof terrace, looking out over the silhouette of the city, watching the crane lights at the port. We didn't talk much about Silas. We talked about the garden. We talked about her childhood. We talked about the silence that finally felt like peace instead of a held breath. But a structural engineer knows that you can't just walk away from a collapse. You have to sift through the rubble to find the black box, the piece of evidence that explains why the failure happened. For me, that black box wasn't a physical object. It was the data I had spent months harvesting. Silas was in a holding cell at the Berkeley County Jail, his lawyers frantically trying to argue for bail. They were painting him as a victim of a senile, vindictive father-in-law who had intentionally sabotaged a historic home and endangered his own family to protect a trust fund. It was a desperate play, a Hail Mary from a man whose facade had been pulverized. One Tuesday morning, as I was sitting in a small bistro on King Street, Silas's lead defense attorney, a man named Sterling Harrison, sat down across from me without an invitation. He was a shark in a $3,000 suit, his eyes cold and transactional. "Mr. Sterling," he said, placing a manila envelope on the table. "My client is prepared to offer you a settlement. If you drop your cooperation with the FBI and sign a statement admitting that the structural failure was due to your own experimental engineering, we will withdraw the mental incapacity filing and the civil suit for the loss of the property." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "And if I don't?" The lawyer leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Silas has told us about the basement, Arthur. He knows you didn't just flood the foundation. He knows you had a surveillance system that wasn't registered with the city. If that comes out, the insurance company won't just deny your claim, they'll prosecute you for insurance fraud and reckless endangerment. You'll spend your retirement in the same cell block as Silas." I looked at the envelope. Silas was still trying to negotiate from the wreckage. He thought he had a piece of me. He thought the secret of the house, the way I had turned it into a trap, was his leverage. "Tell Silas that I'm not worried about the insurance money," I said, sliding the envelope back to him. "The house was fully paid for, and I've already donated the land to the Preservation Trust. I'm not looking for a payout. I'm looking for a resolution." "You're playing a dangerous game, Arthur," the lawyer warned, standing up. "Silas has nothing left to lose. A man like that is a structural hazard." "I know," I replied. "That's why I've already reinforced the perimeter." I watched him walk away, and then I pulled out my phone. I didn't call the police. I called Special Agent Miller. "It's time," I said. "Send the technicians to the East Bay site. Tell them to look for the secondary vault behind the wine cellar's eastern wall. Not the bunker, the vault." What Silas didn't know, what even Harrison hadn't realized when he tried to squeeze me for the trust, was that I hadn't just been recording video and audio. As an engineer who specialized in forensic audits, I knew that the most valuable data isn't what people say, it's what they do on their devices when they think they're secure. When I built the house, I had installed a high-gain, localized wireless sniffer into the very framework of the study. Every time Silas had sat in my library, using my secure guest Wi-Fi to move money, to chat with Jax Blackwood, or to browse his hidden Cayman accounts, the house had been listening to the packets of data. It was a digital wiretap built into the architecture. By the time the sun set that day, Special Agent Miller called me back. His voice was different, no longer the professional investigator, but a man who had just seen a miracle. "Arthur, we found it." The server was encased in a lead-lined box inside the reinforced concrete pillar. It's everything. We have the ledger for the Atlantic City embezzlement. We have the communications between Silas and the offshore banks. But more importantly, we have the records of his consulting work for Jax Blackwood's organization. There's more, isn't there? I asked. Yes, Miller said, a pause in his voice. He wasn't just a borrower, Arthur. Silas was the one who scouted the targets for Blackwood. He was the liquidator for the mob. He found struggling families in historic homes, forced them into debt, and then used men like Jax to clear them out so the land could be flipped. Your house wasn't just a bunker for him. It was supposed to be his headquarters. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I had known Silas was a parasite, but I hadn't realized he was the architect of so much misery. He hadn't just tried to take my house. He had turned the very idea of home into a hunting ground. I didn't know it yet. I thought, but the final reversal wasn't going to happen in a courtroom. It was going to happen in the hearts of the people he had destroyed. The next morning, the news broke. The Charleston Mercury ran a headline that shook the city. The architect of ruin, local liquidator exposed as mob scout. The story didn't just focus on the arrest. It listed the properties Silas had acquired over the last 5 years. There were dozens of them, widows in Ansonborough, retired teachers in Mount Pleasant, small business owners on Broad Street. Suddenly, the vindictive father-in-law narrative evaporated. I wasn't the villain. I was the one who had finally caught the man who was tearing the city apart from the inside. Eleanor came into my room that morning, her eyes red from crying, but her face was clearer than I'd seen it in years. She sat on the edge of my bed and handed me her phone. It was a message from Silas, sent through his lawyer's account. Eleanor, please, don't let him do this. I did it for us. I did it so we'd never have to worry about money again. Tell your father to stop the release of the server data. I'll sign the divorce papers. I'll go away. Just save me from this. Eleanor looked at me. Do you want to know what I told him, Dad? Only if you want to tell me, honey. I told him that he was right about one thing. He said the house was a death trap. I told him he was wrong about who the trap was for. She gripped my hand. I told him to never speak my name again. I pulled her into a hug. The structural integrity of my daughter was restored. She wasn't a script reader anymore. She was the one holding the pen. But as the days turned into weeks, and the demolition of the East Bay house began to clear the way for the Sterling Park, I found myself drawn back to the site one last time. I stood behind the yellow caution tape, watching the heavy machinery claw away at the last of the white columns. The city inspector, the same man who had tagged the house unsafe, walked up to me. Mr. Sterling, we found something in the sub-basement, something we can't identify. I followed him through the mud and the broken brick, down into the hollowed-out space where the library used to be. The water had been pumped out, leaving a layer of gray silt over everything. In the corner, where the primary load-bearing arch had stood, there was a steel box, smaller than a suitcase, bolted directly into the bedrock. We can't get it open, the inspector said, and our thermal sensors are picking up a faint heat signature inside. I knelt in the mud. I knew exactly what it was. It was the one thing I hadn't told anyone, not Eleanor, not Miller, not even Harrison. When I built the house, I hadn't just built a home. I had built a legacy. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the key Harrison had left me in the garden, the one from the Swiss bank. I looked at the lock on the box. It wasn't a standard keyhole. It was a biometric scanner, paired with a mechanical override. I placed my thumb on the scanner. Beep. Then I inserted Harrison's key. Click. The lid of the box swung open. Inside was not money. It was not data. It was a collection of original hand-drawn blueprints. But they weren't for the house on East Bay Street. They were for a series of low-income, sustainable housing developments projects my father and Harrison had started 40 years ago and then abandoned when the greed took over the family. And tucked between the pages was a letter from my father, dated the year I graduated from college. Arthur, if you are reading this, it means the house has served its purpose. I built the East Bay property not as a home, but as a test. I knew the Sterling name would eventually attract the vultures. I knew your brother would lose his way. This box contains the true foundation of our family. Use the trust not to build walls, but to build doors. I looked at the blueprints, then up at the empty sky where my house used to be. I realized then that the collapse hadn't been a tragedy. It had been a demolition. I had to tear down the fortress of my own pride and the greed of my family to find the real work I was meant to do. What happened next was the beginning of the end, I whispered. I stood up, clutching the blueprints to my chest. I looked at the inspector. Tell the city to stop the park project, I said. Sir? The inspector asked, confused. You already signed the land over. I signed it over for ecological and community restoration, I said, a new fire lighting in my chest. And I can't think of anything more restorative than building homes for the people Silas Vane tried to destroy. I walked away from the ruins, my step lighter than it had been in decades. I had lost my house, but I had found my father's dream. Silas was in jail, Harrison was in exile, and Jack's Blackwood was a memory. But as I reached the street, a black sedan pulled up. Not Silas's Porsche, not the FBI's SUV. The window rolled down. It was Harrison. He didn't look like a shadow banker anymore. He looked like a man who had finally stopped running. "You found the box," Harrison said. "I did," I replied. "The Swiss key. There's enough in that account to fund the first 3 phases of the housing project, Arthur. I've been putting money into it for 15 years. I couldn't do it myself. I was too deep in the mud. I needed you to break the house so I could be free of the obligation." I looked at my brother, the man who had sent the Watchers, the man who had let Jack's Blackwood off the leash. "You almost killed Eleanor." "Harrison," I said, my voice cold. "I knew you'd save her," he said, his voice cracking. "I knew you were the only one who could." He shifted the car into gear. "The park is a good idea, Artie. But the houses will last longer." He drove away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk of the city I loved. I looked down at the blueprints. I didn't know it yet, I thought. But the final twist wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. But then, I saw the last page of the blueprint. It was a map of the city. And on it, there were 6 other properties marked with the sterling seal. Properties Silas Vane thought he owned. Properties Harrison had been managing. And properties that were now, legally and structurally, mine. The revenge was complete. But the construction was just beginning. A year in Charleston can change the landscape as much as a hurricane. The humidity still hangs thick over the Cooper River, and the scent of jasmine still fights the salt air for dominance. But the corner of East Bay Street looks like a different world. Where my fortress once stood with its reinforced walls and its secrets buried in the masonry, there is now a wide, green expanse. We call it the Sterling Commons. I stood on the edge of the new brick walkway today, leaning on a cane of my own, not a weighted club like Jax's, but a simple piece of polished oak. My shoulder still aches when the rain moves in, a permanent structural reminder of the night the library ceiling met the bunker floor. But as I watched a group of local kids playing tag near the spot where Silas's Porsche once sat, the phantom weight of that house finally felt like it had been lifted. The legal fallout had been a slow-motion demolition of everything Silas Vane had ever touched. With the data from the secondary vault, the FBI didn't just arrest Silas, they dismantled his entire network. Jack's Blackwood is serving 25 years in a federal facility in upstate New York. Harrison. Well, Harrison is still Harrison. He's currently living in a small, quiet villa in the south of France. He sent me a postcard last month with a picture of a crumbling Roman aqueduct. The message on the back was simple. "Still standing, Artie. Barely. Thanks for the key." I never used that Swiss account for myself. I didn't need to. I took every cent of that retirement bonus and poured it into the first phase of the housing project. We broke ground on the first 4 units last month. Affordable, beautiful homes designed with the same structural integrity I would give a skyscraper. But there was one final thing I had to do before I could truly close the blueprints on this chapter of my life. Last week, I drove out to the federal detention center. I hadn't seen Silas since the day the police led him away in the mud. I didn't go for an apology. I didn't go for closure. I went because a structural engineer never leaves a site until the final inspection is signed off. Silas looked different behind the glass. The custom suits were gone, replaced by a drab orange jumpsuit that made his skin look like parchment. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and the predatory glint in his eyes had been replaced by a hollow, frantic sort of hunger. "You look well, Arthur," he said, his voice tinny through the intercom. "Prison food isn't exactly Hall's Chop House, but it keeps the heart beating." "I'm not here for small talk, Silas," I said. He leaned forward, his fingers tapping against the glass. "You think you won, don't you? You think because you turned the house into a park and put me in here, you've settled the debt. But I know you, Arthur. You're a man of calculations. You lost a $4 million asset. You destroyed your own masterpiece. That's a massive net loss, even for a hero like you." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt nothing but pity. He still thought life was a balance sheet. "I didn't lose anything, Silas. I traded a mausoleum for a legacy. I think my father would have called that a bargain." Silas laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "You're so self-righteous. But you forgot one thing. I was the one who went through your father's old files before I ever moved in. I knew about the housing project. I knew about the land. I was going to build those houses, Arthur. I was going to be the one to save the neighborhood. I just needed your signature to make it profitable. That's the difference between us, Silas, I said, standing up to leave. You wanted to profit from the people you destroyed. I just wanted to stop the destruction. Wait! Silas shouted, his hands slamming against the glass. The house, the night it collapsed. You didn't just trigger the water main. I saw the secondary sensors. You were recording the garden, weren't you? You saw what Jax did to Harrison. I paused. I hadn't told anyone about the footage of Jax striking my brother. I'd handed the server over to the FBI, but I'd kept one file for myself. I saw everything, Silas. Then you know, Silas whispered, a strange dark smile crossing his face. You know that Jax didn't just hit him because he was angry. He hit him because Harrison was about to tell you the real secret. The one our father buried under the garden gate. I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. The blueprints were in the box, Silas. I found them. Not the blueprints, Arthur. The other trust. Silas's eyes lit up with a final, desperate malice. The one for the third Sterling brother. The one you and Harrison were told died in infancy. Our father didn't build that house to test you, Arthur. He built it to hide the inheritance of a man who's been watching you both from the shadows for 40 years. I didn't let him see the tremor in my hand. I simply hung up the intercom and walked away. I didn't know it yet, but Silas's final lie, or his final truth, was the one fracture I couldn't fix with concrete. I drove back to East Bay Street. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the park. Eleanor was there, sitting on a bench near the fountain, reading a book. She looked up and smiled, waving me over. She was the chairperson of the foundation now, and she was doing a better job than I ever could. She had a grace that didn't require steel reinforcements. I sat down beside her, the cool evening air filling my lungs. "How was the visit?" she asked. "Instructive," I said. Silas is still trying to find a way to shift the load. I looked toward the garden gate, or where the gate used to be. The land was flat now, covered in fresh sod and flowers. But my mind went back to the blueprints. I thought about my father, a man who built homes but lived in secrets. "Dad, is everything okay?" Eleanor asked, noticing my silence. I looked at my daughter, the one structure in my life that had survived the collapse and come out stronger. I thought about the key in my pocket, the one Harrison had given me. I thought about the man in the white van who had been watching the house that first night, the one I'd assumed was Jax's man. What if he wasn't? What if the Watchers weren't there to take the house, but to protect the secret buried beneath it? "Everything is fine, Eleanor," I said, patting her hand. "The foundation is solid," and it was. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in a house built on lies. I was living on a piece of land that belonged to the people. I had taken my revenge, not by destroying a man, but by building something he could never understand. But as we got up to leave, I saw a man standing at the far edge of the park. He was tall, dressed in a simple dark coat, watching the sunset. He looked remarkably like my father did in the old photographs. When he saw me looking, he didn't move. He just raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave, a gesture of recognition before turning and walking toward the shadows of the nearby trees. I didn't follow him. A structural engineer knows when to leave a mystery alone. Some foundations are better left buried. What happened next was the most important lesson of all. I thought as Eleanor and I walked toward the car. A house is just a collection of materials held together by physics. It can be burned, it can be flooded, and it can be liquidated. But a family? A family is a different kind of architecture. It's built on the things you forgive, the things you defend, and the truth you're willing to stand on when everything else falls away. I looked back at the park one last time. The lights were coming on, illuminating the space where my life had changed forever. I had lost my house. I had lost my brother's trust. I had almost lost my daughter. But as the city of Charleston settled into the night, I realized that I had finally finished the most important project of my career. I hadn't built a fortress. I had built a home. And this time, I made sure the blueprints were open for everyone to see. I started the truck and pulled out onto East Bay Street. The reflection in the rearview mirror showed the park disappearing into the twilight, a green lung in the heart of the city. Silas Vane was a memory. The Sterling Trust was a legacy, and for the first time in 67 years, I wasn't worried about the cracks in the foundation, because I finally knew the truth. The only way to keep a house from falling is to make sure it's not the only thing holding you up.